Welcome, everyone, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm here with Mia Hughes, who is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Canada and a director of GenSpect. Am I saying that right? GenSpect Canada.
That's correct.
And the author of the WPATH Files. Since I launched this podcast with Jay Bhattacharya in 2023, the Illusion of Consensus, very centered around COVID, but one of the areas that I really wanted to focus on was gender-affirming care, so-called gender-affirming care, and all the strange associations people have with that, and a lot of the misinformation that's been spread by academics and this whole model of gender-affirming care. It's definitely in line with the theme of the podcast, which is the illusion of consensus. There's been this manufactured consensus around treating gender dysphoria in teenagers and kids, which is an issue I've written about briefly a couple years ago in the New York Post, I believe. It's something I'm very interested in and concerned about, and definitely an issue that I care about as someone in Gen Z, sort of the tail end of Gen Z. I do care a lot about this. I think it's a very concerning issue, and I've been wanting to cover this for a while on the podcast. I never really got a chance, but I'm glad to do it now for the first time on the podcast, and I plan to do a bit more coverage on this as well. Mia came on a lot of people's radar last year because she authored the WPATH Files, which exposed some of the misinformed guidelines around gender-affirming care. Mia, thanks for coming on, and we can start there in a sec, but appreciate you coming on to talk about these things. Would love for you to briefly just talk about your background and how you came to this particular issue.
Okay, thank you for having me on. My story is a bit of a strange one, to be honest. Well, we all have strange stories, I think, in this fight, but I was a stay-at-home mother. I'm a Brit. I live in Ottawa. I met my Canadian husband in Taiwan, had my first child, got married there, then we moved to Canada. And I was a stay-at-home mother, 3 children, and around 2019, I was a very uncontroversial person at the time, left-leaning, a little bit woke, kind of embarrassing, and I had no controversial opinions whatsoever. And then on Twitter, I discover the gender issue, and I realize I had been going along with trans women are women, not because I believed trans women were women, just because I thought we were all pretending that they were to be kind, and I couldn't see the harm. And then on Twitter, I discover that when they said trans women are women, they meant trans women are women. They meant that they're women, and therefore they have the right to all spaces and sports and everything that is designated for women. And I thought that was a bit crazy. And then I found out that some of them, these heterosexual men who think that they're women, they're calling themselves lesbians. And so then we get this concept of the male lesbian, and lesbians were being persecuted for refusing these heterosexual men into their dating pool. And I thought that was completely mad. But it was all clownish at that point. I was like, this is strange, this is weird, what's going on? But it seemed very clownish and cartoonish until I found out what was happening in pediatric gender clinics. And then honestly, my life changed because I found out that they were chemically castrating adolescents. They were robbing them of their fertility. They were allowing them to sacrifice their fertility with these experimental drugs based on a self-declared identity, no actual diagnosis, no health problems. They're all healthy. They just have a self-declared transgender identity. They were chopping the breasts off 16-year-old girls, 16-year-old lesbians. A lot of these kids were autistic. And it was when I found out that that was happening, it seemed like such an egregious crime. And the fact that at the time, this is 2019, there were some people had been raising the alarm, but for the most part, society wasn't just ignoring this obvious crime that was occurring in gender clinics, but most people were actually celebrating it. People were marching in the streets demanding that it continue, and people thought that this was a really good thing. And I I became completely fixated on that aspect of it. The social contagion, it's clearly a social contagion, 5,000% increase. Teenage girls coming out as trans in the space of 1 decade. It's clearly a social contagion. And so I researched social contagions. I researched the medical side of it. And I had a tiny Twitter account, like 4 followers. But I just started tweeting about it because I had something to say, and that was my only outlet. And my account grew really quickly, and the one thing led to another. I became a reporter for the Post Millennial Festival based on a Twitter thread. Then I wrote another Twitter thread, and Michael Schellenberger offered me a job, and I went to work for Michael Schellenberger. And then after I went, yes, I was at Public first. I was working for Michael at Public.
Yeah. What year is this?
This is 2023.
Okay.
2023.
Okay.
And then when I went to work for Michael, because I was writing about gender, he hired me to write about the gender issue. And then a source gave him the WPATH files. I don't know who gave them to Michael, but I assume it's because I had gone to write for him and they knew I could write about gender. So then Michael gave me the WPATH files and had me turn them into the report that you were talking about at the start, this 70-page report. It was an expose on the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the organization at the very core of this medical scandal. And if you don't understand WPATH, you can't understand this medical scandal. And so the WPATH files was a stack of documents, and it was leaked internal communications from their internal messaging forum. And it was a really broad range of conversations. The beauty of it was it covered every aspect of this medical crime. Their conversations, they're talking about every aspect of this medical crime. So what I was able to do was tell the entire story of WPATH and the entire story of the scandal with using their own words as a framework. And that's what we released in March 2024. And then from there, I went this year, January 2025, I decided it was time, because I live in Canada and there's so little going on here. We're so far behind the rest of the world that I decided to leave my position with Michael and take a position with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And then I launched GenSpec Canada as well.
Yeah, so let's just dive into some of this. So you mentioned the 5,000% increase in is it transgender identification or gender dysphoria? That statistic.
It is referral. Okay, so that particular statistic is referrals to the pediatric gender service. There was at the Tavistock, it's now closed down, the Gender Identity Development Service at the Tavistock Clinic in London. They, in the space of a decade, saw a 5,337% increase in teenage girls being referred. Now, it's a very interesting question because the diagnosis, goodness me, you see, this is the problem. I can go on and on forever, but the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, I believe, it's a nonsense diagnosis, first of all. There's no meaning to the diagnosis because it is shaped by decades of trans activism. Activists created this diagnosis and therefore they rendered it meaningless. So yes, I suppose you could say it's an increase in gender dysphoria, but really, truly, it's not, because what it is it's an increase in adolescent girls adopting a transgender identity because they are exposed to the messaging of the modern trans rights movement. You see, the surge, the enormous explosion of adolescent girls identifying as transgender coincides precisely with the dawn of the modern trans rights movement, 2014. This is when both things happened at the same time. And the reason that the two things happened at the same time is because the messaging of the modern trans rights movement is the trigger for the social contagion. And it's a very simple formula. You see, if you look at what we're teaching young people, we are basically teaching children and adolescents that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, that could be a sign that you are transgender. Now, find me an adolescent who doesn't feel uncomfortable in their body. It would be a very difficult task. So you immediately put every adolescent at risk when you bombard them with that type of messaging. First of all, you tell them that it's possible to be in the wrong body, and that it's not just that the messaging of trans rights is it's actually natural and healthy and something to celebrate to be trans and to want medical body modification. And so these poor girls, we celebrated trans identities. We put trans celebrities on the cover of magazines. We've got trans YouTubers popping up everywhere doing testosterone and showing off their mastectomy scars. All of this happened at the same time, and then the enormous surge begins. I've said it 1,000 times, but it's the most obvious social contagion, and there have been many, but this is the most obvious one in all of history, and yet we're all over here supposed to pretend that it's not happening.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our new sponsor, Trinergy Health. Here's the truth about psychiatry. Psych meds are neither safe nor effective. So what's the solution for your mental well-being? Trinergy Health offers a 6-month program for mind-body recovery and wellness. Based on the foundational framework of diet, trauma, and toxins, Dr. Aruna and her team help each client address their specific root causes to find vitality, health, and harmony. Using this approach, many clients have successfully healed from so-called incurable illnesses. To schedule an intake appointment, go to psychiatry2.com/schedule or call 262-955-6601. We'll leave all this information in the description below. And use code RAV10 to get 10% discount for the Holistic Psychiatry program. I highly recommend it. I've had Dr. Aruna on my podcast multiple times, and we've had some very deep conversations, which we'll also link below. And we've talked about her framework for diet, trauma, and toxins, and how the mind-body is interconnected, and how what we put into our bodies, what we eat, what experiences we have, the traumas that we've endured in the past, potentially, and the toxins in our environment, in our food, and how that all shapes our mental and physical and even spiritual well-being. Take a look at the information below. I highly recommend it, and go take your intake appointment now. I'm trying to think of how to play devil's advocate here. One, I guess, a counter argument. I'm trying to think who would be making this argument. I've heard this before, like this idea that that the increase in transgender identifying teenagers, how is that any different than the increase in statistics of young people identifying as gay or lesbian? Why is that not the same thing?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to argue against it. They put up a valiant attempt, and I'll give it to them. It's worth it. They gave it the best shot. But we went through gay rights. That's the problem. We went through gay rights. First of all, gay rights was fought over a period of decades. It was small, incremental steps. But we went through gay rights, and it was a massively successful civil rights movement. And yet, never at any point in gay rights did we see, in the space of 1 decade, a sudden surge, a 5,000% increase in teenage girls coming out as lesbians. Never. It didn't happen. We saw slight, gradual increases of people when they could come out as gay because society would accept them and they didn't have to stay in the closet. We did see. But I think we're looking at like a 100%, 160% increase, certainly in openly gay couples. We never saw, and the reason you can tell that it's a social contagion is there are a number of reasons. First of all, whenever a patient population, for a mental health condition, whenever a patient population explodes into existence out of nowhere, the first thing, I love this saying in medicine, there's a saying, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. And so that means always go for the most simple explanation, Occam's razor, but with horses and zebras. And so when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. This is, go for the most obvious explanation. Whenever a patient population appears out of nowhere, think social contagion first of all. If that patient population is adolescent girls, the very demographic known historically to be at the forefront of every single social contagion, bar a couple of, I don't know, school shootings or whatever. If that patient population is adolescent girls, you can be almost absolutely, completely certain that you're dealing with a social contagion. And then the other major flaw with it, and I don't know why they haven't noticed this, is if it were societal acceptance after gay rights, say people in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 60s came out as gay. Finally, society can accept me for being gay. And I've always been gay. I've just been hiding it. I'm now coming out as gay. If this were societal acceptance, why is it only a sudden massive explosion of teenage girls? Where are all the women in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, finally, lining up for their mastectomies and their testosterone because society will accept them for the men that they always were? They don't exist because it's a social contagion. It's the most absurd. Honestly, I at this point, because it's been so long that I've been writing about it and speaking about it, I absolutely despair that anyone could possibly deny it. And then you see, the other thing is, these girls all look the same, and they noticed that right at the beginning. They noticed that, the traditional patients in a gender clinic in the past, pediatric gender clinic, they would have been very effeminate little boys who were destined to grow up to be gay. That's your childhood onset gender dysphoria. They're not trans kids, they're just pre-gay little boys. They're very effeminate, they're very gender nonconforming. That was your classic.
Is that mostly the case? Like, are there other cases of that maybe they might not be gay?
Yeah, actually, I'm recording something on this just tomorrow to have this discussion. So yes, the little boys, I would say, pretty much all of them are just destined to be gay. I would say there's always an exception to the rule, but we are talking the overwhelming majority. The rarest possible case, the little boy will grow up to be heterosexual, but extreme gender nonconformity in childhood is strongly correlated with homosexuality in adulthood. And know how we know that? And it's even more fascinating how we know this.
It's because the majority of teenagers who have gender dysphoria, by the time they end puberty, it just naturally goes away.
Yeah, well, that's the historical. That would be the group, the original group. Yes, it would desist, but just an interesting fact about how we know that extreme gender nonconformity is an indicator of homosexuality in adulthood is because in the 60s they were looking for transsexual children. They had found, like, all of these men were showing up in the clinics and they were saying, I've always known that I was a woman on the inside. I was a very effeminate little boy. And like, these are big hulking heterosexual men. They're not feminine in any way. And so they were lying, saying they'd always been feminine because they thought that was how they could get onto the drugs. So the researchers are like, okay, what we need to do is we need to find these feminine boys. They did a prospective study where they took a whole group of feminine boys and they followed them for 20 years into adulthood, and they were looking for the transsexuals. All they found were future gay kids. That group of effeminate boys that they followed for 20 years, almost all of them were gay. One of them identified as a woman, the rest were gay. So that's actually how we know these effeminate little boys will grow up to be gay. So when we talk about gender medicine being conversion therapy, we're not joking. Gender medicine is actually the new conversion therapy because it takes little boys who would otherwise grow up to be gay men, and it medically converts their bodies, castrates them, and does all kinds of horrible things to them in the name of trans. But you see, the other thing about, like, my point that I was going to make is, in the mid-2010s, this explosion of adolescent girls comes along. Another way you can tell it's a social contagion is none of these adolescent girls had childhood gender distress. They weren't kids who had suffered from gender dysphoria and they always thought they were in the wrong body. No, they had sudden onset feelings of distress with their gender at puberty, right at the time the modern trans rights movement starts. Normally they've been like in online rabbit holes. They've been increasing their amount of time on the internet right before they come out as trans. They've just fallen into an internet rabbit hole. They're watching YouTube, they're watching TikTok, and they interpret all of their struggles, their difficulties. They're not thriving in life. They hate their body. They don't know why. And trans offers them not only the answer, which is you feel bad because you are transgender, but it also offers them the solution, the tantalizing promise that if you take testosterone and if you have your breast cut off, you'll be happy, like all of these internet influencers bouncing around on TikTok. So they're just getting sucked into something that they don't understand. And that's what adolescents do. The crime, it's not their fault. The crime is the monsters in the gender clinics who have lost their moral and ethical compass and have abandoned science and reason, are chopping body parts off them and castrating them and allowing them to go down this medical pathway. Those are the people to blame. And not wanting to be inflammatory or anything, but I really genuinely believe some of them belong in prison for what they've done to these kids.
Yeah. Do you think that all of transgenderism is a social contagion, or do you think there are some cases of someone who's just born trans, or you're nurtured some combination of environment and genes and is just trans, and even at the end of puberty that won't go and they will just have to be trans? Do you think that, or think it's all social contagion?
I think neither of those things are true. First of all, there's no such thing as true trans. This is a whole concept. True trans. Someone is born trans. Absolutely no chance. Nobody. It is not a type of human being. It is not an innate variation of human existence. There are so many different pathways that can lead a person in our culture at this time and in this place to adopt the label trans. And none of them are innate types of human beings. So there's the primary one, the first one, and it's got nothing to do with kids. The first one is the most important one for everyone to understand, is autogynephilia. And this is a paraphilia in which a man is aroused by the fantasy of becoming a woman. So it's not transvestism. It's not like transvestites getting turned on by the clothes. It's men who are actually turned on by the fantasy of being women, having menstrual periods, having breasts, having a vagina, becoming a woman. Most men in society who identify as women and seek medical interventions are these type of men. They're autogynephilic men. So they are aroused by, it turns them on, and they want the breasts and the female body parts and everything because that's a paraphilia. That's an erotic motivation. So that's your first group.
And is there any proven treatment for that, like psychotherapy or like anything that could be done for that other than radical surgical intervention? And
right, this is the problem with autogynephilia. It's a paraphilia. Paraphilias do not respond to psychotherapy. You cannot talk someone. Yeah, like pedophilia, zoophilia, autogynephilia, like these paraphilic obsessions. You can't do talk therapy. You're not getting the man past it. I wonder if you could help him control his urges. You're not going to get rid of the urge because it seems to be fixed and it's not going anywhere. But perhaps you could help him control his urges. Or, and this is probably controversial, don't know if I've said this publicly, like if it's a sexual urge, and if it's an urge that is sort of overpowering and difficult for this man to function otherwise, I wonder if a way to bring down that powerful sexual urge in a chemical way is a more humane way than inverting his penis, giving him breasts, and sending him out into the world pretending to be a woman. Especially in this climate where we're definitely at the place where he's not welcome in women's spaces. There may have been a time when women would have tolerated him in their spaces, but at this point, there's so much bad feeling because of how trans activists have behaved that these men are not welcome. So if he's going to go all the way and get all the surgeries and everything, and then he still can't enter women's spaces because no one wants him there, perhaps some way to help him deal with his sexual urges is a more humane way, but trans activists will not see it that way, I guarantee.
Yeah.
But
Okay,
that's
that's interesting.
so.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's unfortunate that like I mean, I don't know anyone like this. I've never looked at this, but what, you know, if someone has that, what do you do with that? If there's no psychotherapy for that, that's very difficult for them. If you know,
It,
yeah. Putting
it
aside morals and
is.
ethics here, I'm just saying, in theory, someone like as you described having these impulses, but there not being any good treatment for that, or just inherent long-term status or long-term progression of that. With say with gender dysphoria, you have puberty as a corrective mechanism, which is pretty incredible and worth mentioning. But for this is, as you said, that there's not really anything that can be done.
There's not. Oh, I do think perhaps there could be some coping ways to cope, but no. There's a book written by an autogynephilic man, and the book has a great title, my favorite title, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. And it's hundreds of autogynephilic men telling everything. Basically, it's actually an insane read, all of their fantasies and all of their everything. Like, these men will fantasize about having menstrual periods, they fantasize about having abortion. Wow. They fantasize about anything. Like, some fantasize about being in a knitting circle, you know, like, it's really so. It's a fascinating subject, but you read Men Trapped in Men's Bodies, it's hundreds of pages long, and it's hundreds of accounts of autogynephilia, and you can't help, I think most people can't help but come to the end and think, wow, it's not easy to live with. There's no question. Being autogynephilic is not easy to live with. The problem is the entire trans rights movement is spearheaded by autogynephilic men who thought they could rewrite society around their paraphilic desires. They thought that they could create a world in which they were women. You know, that's what they did. We live in Canada, both of us, so we live in an autogynephilic man's dream. In Canada, autogynephilic men are women, and we all have to pretend that they are. But they thought they could create a world in which they could be actual women, and that's all falling apart for them now because their rights movement pushed way too far, and it's all falling apart because they went after kids. That was their greatest mistake. They thrust their bonkers reality onto kids. Kids got sucked into it and ended up with body parts missing, and now society is pushing back. But anyway, that's the main group of men, though.
Okay. And before we go on to the next one, I love playing devil's advocate on this podcast, and this is an argument I've actually heard from more conservative religious friends when we're talking about things like that, and I'm agreeing with my religious conservative friends on the concerns about transgenderism, and then like the case like you brought up of autogynephilia. There's a conservative religious argument there which has been made of like, well, how is that different from homosexuality? Like, why are we like, okay, like why isn't it like the same in terms of impulses that shouldn't they be controlled, and shouldn't these should these not be in similar classes? Yet, you and I are defending gay rights and not lumping it into this category.
Well, they're two completely different things, first of all. So think about what gay rights fought for, essentially, was society to accept that two people of the same sex could love each other and be together in a relationship. And that doesn't ask that much of society. We don't have to restructure anything. We don't have to believe in anything mystical or magical. We just have to accept that two people of the same sex may fall in love and want to be in a relationship. Sure, okay. Now think about what trans rights asks of us. We all have to accept that. Well, first of all, we have to accept the complete destruction of the meaning of the words man and woman. Suddenly, the very foundation blocks of our human race, man and woman, are no longer have meaning, because some males can be women and some females can be men. So you have to destroy the very essence of what it means to be human. First of all, you have to rewrite what it means to be human. We've got male women and female men. And then these male women have to be allowed into female-only spaces. And if you let a male into a female-only space, that female-only space ceases to exist. It's a mixed-sex space. So women have to give up all of their sex-based protection because this rights movement demands it. And if they don't, well, they'll be accused of transphobia and they'll lose their job and their family will be attacked and whatever, because it's a terrible crime to be transphobic. And then on top of that, these male women, they require major hormonal and surgical body modification, all covered by the taxpayer or insurance. It turns them into lifelong medical patients. And as if that weren't bad enough, that's bad enough. But then we got to do it to children as well. Trans rights insists that some children are born in the wrong body. And the reason that they insist this, the only way that a man can be a woman is if you destroy the meaning of the word woman and you recreate it. And that's what they did. The word woman no longer means an adult human female in their minds. The word woman means a person with any sexed body who has a female gender identity. So they had to come up with this idea that everyone possesses a gender soul. And it's your gender soul that makes you a man or a woman, not the reality of your body. That was the new reality that they created. And so because we all possess a gender identity, and that's what makes us men or women, that's also what makes us boys or girls. So they had to teach this to children. They told children, you possess something inside you called a gender identity, and that's what makes you a boy or a girl. And when they did that, they untethered an entire generation of kids from the reality of their body. And the gender nonconforming little boys who would grow up to be gay, they were the most at risk because they're taught a sign that they have a female gender identity is that they like the Barbie dolls and princess gowns and sparkles. And so all of these little boys, they think that they're girls. Trans rights demands that we pretend that they're girls. Trans rights demands that we hand them into a gender clinic so that they can have medical treatments for which there is not a single shred of scientific evidence to justify them. Like, gay rights didn't demand any of that. Imagine, just take a moment to imagine what gay rights would have been like if they had said, okay, gay men are at risk in men's spaces, so you have to let them into women's spaces. Can you imagine? Like, women would have said, no, thanks, absolutely not. But if they had ruined the lives of anyone who said, no, we don't want these men in our spaces, nobody would have supported gay rights. Imagine if gay rights, for some mad reason, had said, you got to chemically castrate all of these effeminate little boys over here. Nobody would have supported gay rights. Like, the imposition on society, the insane demands of trans rights on society has made it that there is no possible way that there can be societal acceptance of transgender people now. They ruined it. And the reason, I'll say this though, they ruined it. They made the choice in about the 1980s when they decided they were going to launch this rights movement. They had a choice at that point. They could have based their rights movement in reality. Okay? They could have gone with, it would have been a hard sell. They could have gone with, okay, some men like to masturbate to the thought of having a menstrual period and they like to wear women's clothing, and would you welcome them into your spaces? It's very likely that women would have said, absolutely no way. There's no way we don't want those men in our spaces. Instead, they decide, okay, we're going to create a whole new reality. We're going to force it on all of Western society in the most well-funded, top-down, behind-the-scenes, orchestrated, ready to go away in the mid-2010s. We're just going to thrust it on society, and then we're going to ruin anyone who dares to question it. That was their strategy. That's what they did. And it's backfiring massively now, and quite rightly so.
I totally agree with you, and that's really well said. But the parallel I was attempting to draw, which I don't think is correct, but again, coming from a devil's advocate perspective, just to be clear, if anyone's confused, but why draw the line at autogynephilia? Like, and I totally agree with you on the societal implications stuff of what you're saying, gay rights versus trans rights. But just in terms of the maybe the psychology of it, or the inner state of it, or the personal rights of it, like if it's autogynephilia is men who are sexually aroused by becoming a woman, fantasizing about becoming a woman, and you're saying, we should encourage ways for them to control their sexual impulses. Well, again, why not make that argument for gay people? Again, let's put aside like bathrooms and sports, but just like the condition of you have a sexual impulse that deviates from the standard, in this case, being heterosexual, monogamous relationship, and being being cisgender. But here in either cases, you're deviating from that. Why not? Why would you draw the line between those two things, and not rather in both cases allow individuals who are gay and autogynephilic to pursue their sexual impulses freely?
I think it's very simple. Look at the impact on your life. If you're gay, I will say, because I have a number of gay friends, that life is more difficult if you are gay, and I think largely because your dating pool is so much smaller. My two best friends, actually, when I was in high school, both of them are lesbians, and there were no lesbians in our high school. So you're gay, or there were no out lesbians at the time, but there weren't very many. Your dating pool is much smaller, so that is going to make finding a partner more difficult. Like in high school, if there's no other lesbian in high school, my friend ended up developing crushes on a lot of straight women who would never reciprocate because they were straight. So it is more difficult, but look at the impact on your life of being autogynephilic. First of all, it is an all-consuming obsession that drives these men to the point that they want to have their penises surgically inverted. They get castrated, so they have no sex hormones for the rest of their lives, which instantly turns them into a lifelong medical patient. And then they will go so far as to have their penis surgically inverted and turned into an open wound that has to be dilated for the rest of their lives. This is, if you don't shove a dilator up there, the wound closes up because the body will naturally always try to heal the wound. So these men have got to dilate for the rest of their lives. They will go on hormones that destroy their health. They will have breast implants. It makes their life so much more difficult to be, and then at the end of it, you're not a woman. They go through all of that. They have their penis inverted. They have the breast implants. They're lifelong medical patients. They'll probably have facial surgery to try and look more like women. They might have their Adam's apple done. And at the end of all of that, they're still not women. So they're still living a lie, and every single one of them knows somewhere on the inside that they have not transformed into a woman. The ones who accept that probably live healthier, psychologically healthier lives. So sure, you might have a smaller dating pool. Life might be a tiny bit harder if you're gay. If you are autogynephilic and the way to peace and happiness is to have that done, that is going to impact your life. And then I don't know if you're familiar with my work, but I was for a long time obsessed with, there's a parallel paraphilia to autogynephilia, and I love this one. It's called apotemnophilia, and it is, so autogynephilia means love of oneself as a woman. That's what you break down the word. That's what it means. Apotemnophilia means love of oneself as an amputee. And these are men, sometimes women, but typically men, who are sexually aroused by the fantasy of becoming amputees. They're typically also sexually attracted to amputees. So it's a kind of inversion back on themselves. These men, absolutely, the same as autogynephiles, they absolutely fixate on becoming amputees, to the point that many of them will try to self-amputate the leg or whatever it is that they want taken off. There's a man in Quebec, actually, we just chopped his fingers off because he was obsessed with having his fingers chopped off, but that's another story. And so the parallel that I often draw with apotemnophilia is, if a man, the funny thing is, surgeons won't do this. They won't chop off a leg. Now, chopping off a leg is much simpler than inverting a penis, and it has far fewer lifelong health implications than inverting a penis. But medically, medical ethics boards will not allow surgeons to chop off healthy legs, but they will allow them to invert penises. But the big difference for me is, if a man succeeds in his quest to get his leg chopped off for his erotic desire, he actually does become an amputee. He's there, he's made it. Whereas the man who has his penis inverted and the breast implants and the hormones, he's still not a woman at the end of it. So if we were looking at it from from a sane place, we would actually be amputating the legs of the apotemnophiliac men, and we would not be inverting the penises of the autogynephilic men. But the thing is, there aren't billionaire apotemnophiliac men funding this movement and creating a big rights movement so they can get their legs chopped off. Whereas there were billionaire autogynephilic men funding their movement so they can have their penises inverted and they can be treated like women.
Yeah, so your opinion and recommendation is, but for people who are autogynephiliacs, that they shouldn't do all these things to try and become a woman to satisfy their sexual impulses, but they should learn to just control it. And then are these often straight guys or
they're
like,
all heterosexual. They're all heterosexual men.
Okay.
That's they're attracted to women, but it kind of gets inverted in on themselves, and they're attracted to themselves as women. I am actually not saying anything about how I think anyone should manage autogynephilia, to be clear. What I am saying is the trans rights movement, and when we get to the HHS report, that we can talk about this as well. The trans movement makes out that this inverting the penis, the breast implants, the hormones, they make out that this is life-saving medical care, and that it is a human right for an autogynephilic man to access this medical care, and if he doesn't, he may die. And yet they don't have any proof of that. They can say that, they've said it, they just repeat. You repeat a lie often enough and everyone will believe it. That's what they do. They created this idea that it was life-saving care. But in order to prove that it is, you would need to have long-term follow-up studies that show that all of these men are actually thriving and well and healthy. And in the past, there have been many stages of this medical scandal. The first time they ever did any follow-up, so it really started in the 1960s. And the first time they ever did any follow-up in the US was in the late 1970s. And that's when the main gender clinic was at Johns Hopkins. That's where John Money was. It's the infamous gender clinic. And Dr. Paul McHugh did the follow-up there, all the first wave of men who had gone through the experiment. And they basically found that the men, they said they were happy, but nothing about their life situation had changed. They were not thriving by any stretch of the imagination. And so Paul McHugh decided, we're colluding with a mental illness rather than trying to help these men. We're not going to do it anymore. And he shut down the clinic. At the same time in the Netherlands, because they were doing it in the Netherlands as well, they do their first follow-up study that comes out in 1998. And they realize nothing about the life situation of these men has improved. And again, they said they were happy, but nothing about their life had improved. And then the Swedes do a follow-up, the Swedish study that is often quoted. They found that the rates of suicide after 10 years post-transition were astronomically high for these men, mostly men, but some women who had undergone medical transition. That it's not that it increased their risk of suicide, but it certainly did not eliminate the risk of suicide. The rates were so high. And so you can't say that all of these men are thriving and well if you don't follow anyone up. You can't say that they're thriving and well based on the studies that we do have, because the studies show that that's not true. There's either really high suicide rates or their life situation is pretty grim. So just because trans activists say that this is life-saving care, it doesn't mean it is. They've got to show the proof, and they don't have that proof.
And the Sweden study, you're saying the rates for suicide were higher than before transitioning?
No, you can't. It does not say that, because the thing is, they didn't assess how the rates of suicide before. All they did was they took the records of every single person who had transitioned. They have centralized record keeping, and they analyzed the records, and they found that 10 years post-transition, the suicide rate was like 19 times higher than the general population. So this is not a medical treatment that has magically solved all of their problems and everyone's living a wonderful life. And, you know, it stands to reason. These men go into it with very unrealistic expectations, I think. They go into it thinking that it is going to transform them into women and they are going to be happy and healthy and everything will be wonderful. And then when they get to the other side, perhaps life isn't quite what they thought it would be. So it makes sense that they're not thriving, and it makes sense that the suicide rate is high, because you can't go back. Once you've had your penis inverted, you cannot uninvert the penis. And so it does make sense that this is not a way to a fulfilling life. But I'm not saying it's bad for everyone. I'm not even saying it should be banned. And I'm not saying it's the wrong approach for some, because I can't say that. I'm not an expert, but I can say that it should be the last resort. If there were any other way to help these men, rather than inverting their penises, rather than the breast implants and the lifelong medical intervention, that's the approach we should take. And that's where the research focus should be, is helping these men rather than doing such extreme measures.
Yeah. So there's no evidence that gender transition lowers suicide rates?
Absolutely none whatsoever.
And
yet
so where did that come from?
Okay, this is back to WPATH. So
okay.
WPATH is, World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is supposedly the leading medical or professional association that sets the guidelines, and everybody looks to WPATH for all matters related to gender medicine. They are the experts, supposedly. And so WPATH is an activist group masquerading as a professional medical association. They are just extremist trans activists, and many of them happen to have medical licenses, is the best way to look at it. And so WPATH, the activist framing of this is, they decided, first of all, that gender-affirming care, so-called, is medically necessary. Now, not because they have any proof that it's medically necessary, in that there's an illness that you can treat and this is the best evidence-based approach to treat it. No, they don't have any proof. They just decided one day that it's medically necessary. They called it medically necessary and everybody went along with it. Okay, sure, this is medical. They also decided it was life-saving care based on the lowest quality of evidence in evidence-based medicine is surveys. So you ask a bunch of people, are you happy with your gender transition? And they all say yes. And then so your survey says medical transition makes people happy. It solves mental health issues. It's a survey. And so they ask a bunch of people, were you suicidal when you wanted to transition? And they say, oh, yes, I was. I tried to commit suicide. And then they say, okay, now you've transitioned. Are you suicidal? And they're like, no, I feel great. It's amazing. And so they take that kind of garbage junk science study and they say, this is proof that gender affirming care is life-saving care. It's becoming increasingly indefensible in that there's a Supreme Court case in the US going at the moment, the Scrimeti case in Tennessee. Well, it's a Tennessee. It was somebody, the ACLU, and I'm pretty sure Southern Poverty Law Center tried to overturn the Tennessee ban on youth gender medicine, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. We'll have the decision in a few weeks, I think. And in the Supreme Court, you can't just make up trans activist lies in the Supreme Court. And so, under oath, one of the leading trans activist lawyer types in this fight was asked, is gender affirming care life-saving care? Does it actually prevent suicide? Do we have actual evidence? And this leading lawyer, Chase Strangio, had to admit under oath that no, we don't have a single shred of evidence to suggest that it prevents suicide, because the suicides are already so rare. It's not like there's a massive suicide epidemic of all these kids who they don't get puberty blockers, they don't get, hormones, so they're just offing themselves. There's no massive epidemic. But transactivism, it's a way to emotionally blackmail parents and governments into making laws, and it's a way for them to get what they want. They use the transition or suicide narrative, because how could you deny these kids this care? How could you deny this group of people this care if they're going to commit suicide otherwise? But it's all fabricated. It's all based on thin air. Is everything okay? Are you having technical difficulties?
Interesting. No, we got it sorted. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's just similar to an area that I focused a lot on in 2020 when I started my journalistic career, which is the narrative around Black Lives Matter and police shootings. And a lot of the data there was quite skewed and misrepresented. And similarly here, I did not know the story on this, so I appreciate you informing me on this. Is there also, going back a little bit to what we were saying earlier, is there any sense of the broader picture of gender ratios for gender dysphoria? Like, is it a similar situation with gender dysphoric boys versus gender dysphoric girls?
For what exactly? Referrals, or what do we?
I mean, is it a similar set of issues for gender dysphoric boys versus gender dysphoric girls? Also wondering if one group is higher. I assume the gender dysphoric girls is a higher group, but for gender dysphoric boys, I assume that's the minority of cases. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but is it similarly, body image issues, eating disorders, and also are the rates of homosexuality kind of the similar picture of these are effeminate boys, and on the other side, is it more masculine girls who are just going to end up being lesbian, or are there any differences in those two cohorts that are meaningful?
Yeah, so I realized I went way off on a tangent and didn't even answer your question earlier. So this ties us back. So that's good. Because the autogynephilia, I always get sucked into talking about that.
Oh,
so
all good.
The demographics are very interesting. So traditionally there would have been just your autogynephilic men, and then your classic childhood onset little effeminate boys who would grow up to be gay, and then the adult version of them. So the adult gay men, extremely gender nonconforming, they would make up the minority of trans-identified men, which some people call trans women. But then that existed until around 2010 or the mid 2010s, and then this new explosion, the social contagion. Yes, it's predominantly adolescent girls. They made up the bulk of it, and they still do. And there are many different psychiatric comorbidities that lead them. It doesn't even have to be a psychiatric comorbidity. It can just be the struggles of puberty. I think it's largely that for many of the girls. And it can be, many are on the autism spectrum, but a kind of high functioning autism. It can be response to trauma if they've experienced a sexual assault and they don't want to be female. Can be depression, all sorts of just your average run-of-the-mill psychiatric comorbidities. But yeah, the boys are different, so that's a really good question. The boys who get sucked into this, I would say a large number of them are definitely high-functioning autistic, and they're the weird, quirky kids who they don't quite fit in, and trans just seems to make sense to them in this. They get derailed, they get given this message that if they don't fit in, if they don't like their body, or if they like certain things, could be a sign they're trans. And especially if they're spending a lot of time online, and if they fall into the wrong place, the wrong internet rabbit hole,
and
they can be
mostly
exposed.
Gay boys? This is mostly gay boys you're talking about?
I would not actually say it's mostly. I mean, to be honest, I do think, yes, it's probably more skewed to the homosexual adolescents. But there are some fascinating theories. One of them is toxic masculinity. When we made everything about being masculine toxic, we destabilized a whole generation of boys coming of age into adolescence, and suddenly everything about being a boy, being masculine is toxic. And many of these boys, and I'm not making this up, like detransitioned men have told me this, that they just looked at themselves and they thought, and they were the sweet, gentle little boys, and they were not the toxic masculine men that they were reading about, that were being demonized. And something at a very low point, they just mistook that for a sign that they weren't really boys, or they didn't want to be boys because they didn't want to be one of those toxic masculine boys and men that is so vilified. So something just went wrong in their development, and they, in the wrong internet rabbit hole, came to the conclusion that that meant that they were women. So there's an awful lot going on, and the boys are way more complicated. There can be, I mean, I think exposure to porn, this is a controversial theory, and no one studied it as far as I know, but there's a detransitioned young man who became convinced, he is convinced that he suffered from a rapid onset autogynephilia from watching too much porn when he was too young. And you can quickly apparently find yourself in these trans porn rabbit holes as well. There's some very awful places online that young boys who have no sexual experience can find themselves. And he is convinced that he developed something like a pseudo autogynephilia that's not actually programmed into his mind. And he became convinced, he became aroused by the fantasy of being a woman from all the porn that he was watching. But he came out the other side, and he says he no longer has those desires. So life has changed, culture has changed, and being an adolescent is so disembodied that many young people, because they're already disembodied, because much of their life is taking place online, and because they're being bombarded, trans is so celebrated, trans is so pervasive and absolutely everywhere in our culture, and the messaging that they're receiving is really quite as simple as, if you feel weird, if you feel uncomfortable, if you don't like your body, if you like this, if you like that, that could be a sign that you're trans. And it's very easy, I think, when you're in a vulnerable place. I would say none of the kids who fall into this are thriving. That's what they all have in common. Most of them are isolated. Most of them are struggling in some way, and they fall upon trans as the answer because that's what society has forced down their throats in school, on social media, everywhere. It's such a...
Yeah. So for boys, it's mostly effeminate boys who don't fit in, right? Is that
it can be effeminate, or it can just be, it can be, honestly, I think, social difficulties, autism spectrum. I'm not talking like nonverbal autism, but like the quirky, weird kids. There's actually a psychiatrist, I'm pretty sure he's a psychiatrist, as Hakeem. If you want to invite him on your show, he has the most amazing theory that this social contagion of trans is the new goth, and he talks you through he was goth Mark 1 in like the 1980s in Wales, and he talks you through the different stages of goth, and then we go to emo, and then it's trans, and it's a very compelling theory. So it's all the kids who would have been goth or they would have been emo. They're just the youth subculture, but this youth subculture offers body part amputation. This youth subculture turns you into a lifelong medical patient. And that's what makes it so horrifying.
Yeah. So, but do we have any rough percentages of this radical increase in transgender identification? Is it, like 75% girls, 25% boys? Do we have any sense of that?
I would say so. I mean, no, I would say you're about right there. There are tons of graphs everywhere for the referrals, certainly, to the pediatric gender clinics. And yeah, I'd say probably the bulk, 75% of the surge is adolescent girls, but still a 25% surge in boys is a significant number. We talk so much about the girls because they make up most of the numbers, and we do an injustice to the boys when we ignore them, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be you have to talk about what's statistically happening most, so you'll inevitably talk about girls more.
Yeah.
I also, and I bet Jordan Peterson's talked about this, and if he hasn't, I should email him about this or something. But I'd be curious what the psychological predispositions for gender dysphoria would be, and we obviously know the comorbidities in terms of anxiety, eating disorders, anorexia, but I also wonder in terms of like big five personality scales of like openness, neuroticism, things like that, how those might factor into those things. And we know there are gender differences in psychological disposition, so I wonder if anyone's done any research into that, of what kind of psychological disposition is most likely conducive or most likely to lead to gender dysphoria.
I'm very much focused, I'm very much fixated on it just being culture bound, in that I can't even talk about gender dysphoria as if it's a real diagnosis, because it's not. It's certainly not a standalone diagnosis. It's a symptom of something else going on in your life. That's all it is. It's a combination of life struggles colliding with the madness of the trans rights movement, and people just get shot off in the wrong direction. There will be, there's an overlap between autogynephilia and narcissistic personality disorder. I'm going to say that, but I don't know if it's as big an overlap as people make out. I think autogynephilia I think it can look like narcissism, but it's actually just it's a man in love with himself, is a man obsessed with himself. To me, it really truly is a vulnerable person in a very bad place in life, colliding with an ideology that I believe is poison.
Just quick question: did you just hear the lawn mowing outside?
I did not.
You didn't? Okay. If you hear it, let me know. My mom's mowing the lawn. I told her I'm doing a podcast in the basement. My backyard's behind me.
Excuse me.
Let me know if you
these
ever
microphones, I think we have the same one. They sound. There's good sound canceling.
Good.
I find mine works really well.
No, that's really interesting. But and I I'm agreeing with you, but this is a difference in how we both said it. But I think psychology is a big part of this, right? Girls who are dealing with a lot more emotionally, whether that's autism spectrum or eating disorders, anorexia, anxiety, depression, all those things seem to be factors that correlate with gender dysphoria. So like, as in girls who are not dealing with crippling anxiety, eating disorder, body image issues, have more stable homes, more loving parents, more stable condition at home, are probably less susceptible to gender dysphoria. It seems to be, right?
I mean, a lot of the ROGD, the rapid onset gender dysphoria kids, they really do. I've met so many of the parents. They really do come from loving, stable families, parents who doted on them, and they never lacked for anything. So there is something of a correlation between foster care, because that's a vulnerable kid. But I don't know that much about the family structure. It's really truly just the struggles of life. Yeah, basically what you're saying, though. It's not, I wouldn't say it's definitely there's the autism spectrum type, the quirky, weird girls. There's also the borderline personality type, which is not strictly diagnosed in adolescence, because most kids display borderline traits, but there's definitely that borderline type with the unstable sense of self, and constantly you don't really have any idea of who you are and you're switching. They can get sucked into the whole gender thing. There's just so many, and that's the problem. Hilary Cass, in the Cass review, well, I think it was the interim, but I think she talked about it in her final report. There's something called diagnostic overshadowing in mental health, and that is where one complaint overshadows everything else, and just in gender, what's happening is they're going in and they're saying that they're trans, and that's the only focus of treatment. It's called diagnostic overshadowing. All of the other issues that they have, the trauma, the depression, the borderline, the autism, everything, it's all being ignored, and only gender is being treated. But that's the wrong way around, because gender dysphoria needs to be viewed as a symptom of autism spectrum disorder. It needs to be viewed as a symptom of depression, a symptom of borderline personality disorder. I think gender dysphoria needs to be relegated down from a primary diagnosis. It's never the primary diagnosis. There's always something else going on in that patient's life, and it's the job of the therapist to find out why this person has come to the conclusion that they will be happier modifying their body. That's the humane way to treat these people. But because of trans activism, you see, I agree with trans activists in a strange way, but we come at it in the opposite direction. I think we would be better off if gender dysphoria were not in the DSM at all. Not as a diagnosis, but just it could be a symptom, like I said, of all those other comorbidities. Trans activists think it shouldn't be in the DSM because it's not a mental disorder. They think it's a perfectly natural, healthy existence. And so we both want the same thing, but for very different reasons. But the reason why you can't do differential diagnosis with kids who say that they're trans, the reason that you can't investigate why they've come to the conclusion that they are trans is precisely because trans activism redefined gender dysphoria, redefined transgender identities as being perfectly natural and healthy. And therefore, if it's natural and healthy, you don't need to find out what's caused it, because there's nothing wrong. It's also, if it's natural and healthy, you don't need to try and help the young person overcome it, because there's nothing to overcome. It's healthy. And so all of the problems stem from trans activism redefining this very serious psychiatric or psychological symptom of distress. They redefined it as being natural and healthy. And that's where all of our problems come from.
Yeah. So you were saying earlier that there's no indication that a deficit in family structure has been clearly outlined for gender dysphoria. And just to put a finer point on that, is there any indication that any correlation between trauma and gender dysphoria?
Well, I should make clear what I'm saying, in that it's there are certain indicators, there are certain patterns that have been observed, and divorced parents is one of them. So these kids do have a higher, they're often they've gone through parental divorce, which can be challenging for a child or an adolescent when you're in this difficult stage of life. So there is that. Divorce has been shown to be more prevalent amongst these kids. And as well, Dr. Hilary Cass, again in the Cass report, what they called adverse childhood events, which can be the loss of a parent, can be sexual assault, can be any traumatic event in childhood. There was a significantly higher rate of adverse childhood events in this cohort as well. So I'm not saying they all live lives of rainbows and sunshines and everybody's super happy and from solid homes, but I am saying that there are many, many, many of these kids who are from the stable home, who had everything, and they just had a normal adolescent angst moment, fell into an internet rabbit hole and believed that that transition would solve all of their problems. So there are trauma, definitely. We've seen it. Honestly, I once compiled a summary of all of the ongoing malpractice lawsuits, which is one of the most horrible tasks I've ever done, because I had to read all of the legal complaints for all of these, some boys, but mostly girls, who are suing for malpractice because of gender medicine. And the number of times I came across trauma, they'd been sexually assaulted, or they'd experienced ongoing child abuse, or they'd experienced sexual abuse as children. Trauma, all the way through all of these stories. And because they showed up at gender clinics and they found themselves in the hands of a person with no understanding, a person who saw them as a transgender child, the person didn't see them as a young woman who had been traumatized and was wanting to escape her female body. This person saw them as a transgender boy in need of hormonal and surgical body modification. And that's the activist framing of it. When you prevent the deep exploratory therapeutic approach where you really have to get in and find out what's going on with these kids, when you abandon all of that and you call it conversion therapy, you can only harm the child. How is chopping a girl's breasts off a remedy for a sexual assault? How is pumping her full of testosterone a drug that is known to negatively impact a woman's mental health? How is pumping her full of testosterone going to solve the trauma of a sexual assault? It's not. She's just trying to escape her female body. And these monsters in gender clinics see her as a boy in need of testosterone and a mastectomy.
Yeah, and by the way, 30 seconds ago, you were not hearing any lawn mowing sounds?
I did not. I mean, I hope I'm not.
Okay.
I didn't hear anything. I have traffic out the window. You're not hearing my traffic?
No, I'm not. Yeah, I'll double check this recording after. Anyway,
we should do we should do an advert for these mics.
Yeah.
They should sponsor you.
I didn't know that the adverse childhood events were higher in trans identifying kids. Can
I just add one? I just add one horrifying statistic as well? This is from Hannah Barnes's book Time to Think.
Horrify us.
Which is the story of the scandal that occurred at England's Youth Gender Service, the Tavistock, that's recently closed. They found there was a northern branch of the Tavistock in Leeds, and they found that the kids, the referrals there, they had I think it was like a 10-fold increased chance of living with a person on the sex offenders registry. Basically, I think what we were seeing was these were very likely victims of childhood sexual assault because somebody in their home was on the sex offenders registry, and they had a considerably higher rate of living with a sex offender, and yet nobody did anything about it. Nobody said, hang on a minute, is there some kind of connection here? Nobody investigated it. They just ignored it. They acknowledged they saw it and they just ignored it.
Really? 10 times greater likelihood of living with a sex offender, like a parent?
Yeah. It's in Hannah Barnes's Time to Think.
And this is a great for trans identifying youth?
Yeah.
Wow.
At the Tavistock, at this one branch. I'm not putting that as the entire. Don't apply that to everyone, but that was and it wasn't at the London version of the Tavistock, it was at the Leeds version of the Tavistock. So that's the northern branch. Yeah.
And so do you think that this is more than correlation? The trauma, do you think it could be causal rather than just correlative?
I certainly do. I mean, you can't know for sure, but it makes complete sense because of everything that I've just said. There could be some other factor, it could just be completely coincidental, but it makes complete sense because look at what trans is. It offers you can become someone new. And if you hate who you are, and if you hate your existence, and you come across this opportunity to reinvent yourself, and it's pushed on them in such a way that not only can they reinvent themselves and they can be someone new, but they can also be celebrated because we put trans on such a pedestal. We celebrate all the celebrities. If you see a kid coming out as trans at school, there are videos of like a girl saying, I'm a guy, and everybody's clapping and cheering, and the teachers are really enthusiastic. There's like this big sort of parade of celebration when a kid comes out as trans. So it makes sense that any kid who is struggling. Oh, here's another one though. I mean, we've got in our gender clinics, Indigenous youth make up about 4% of the population, I believe. In Canada's gender clinics, when they did a demographic survey, they found that Indigenous youth made up 18% of the referrals. Now, of course, that could be pushing two-spirit down their throats as if that means something to their culture, but it could also be that Indigenous youth are growing up in more likely to grow up in difficult situations, and anyone who is struggling has just this opportunity to become someone new. And the medical treatment is sold in such a way that it will solve all of your problems. You will be happy. You can be a whole new person. I wonder if I should turn on my light. Is this going to be too bright? Ooh, okay, hang on.
It looks fine either way. Both.
Looks
good.
Okay, it's getting really dark here.
Yeah. This is all very interesting, and definitely the role of psychology is notable and relevant, and for things like anxiety, depression. One broader point I'll make, by the way, and I've explored this in the podcast, and I'm going to explore it more. People can watch my podcast with Roger McFillin, who's a psychologist. We talked about this, but when you were framing gender dysphoria as a symptom, that's also, I would say, a better way of understanding mental illness in the DSM-5 of depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
Depression and anxiety, more aptly put, they're not explanations, they're descriptions.
Yeah.
They're descriptive, not explanatory. And I went over this in my podcast, or actually, we didn't do a podcast yet on this. Me and Matt Johnson, who's a psychology background, but he's a psychedelic researcher, probably the most prolific psychedelic researcher alive. And we talked about this privately in a phone call, and we should do a podcast on that because it's so interesting. But depression and anxiety and PTSD, they're not an explanation for anything. They're a description of what's happening. And the explanation could be ranging from trauma to nutrient deficiencies to lack of social interaction to potentially even environmental toxins, what you're eating, how much sunlight you're getting, how much exercise you're getting, how much social interaction you're getting, how much you're dancing and laughing and doing fun things for yourself, trauma and just negative thought patterns and negative beliefs, which are, trauma, I'm just understanding in much more of an expansive spectrum than coming from war or sexual assault, rape, any of these horrible things, abusive parenting. Trauma, just broadly speaking, of difficult things happening, and that configures your mind and your perceptions of reality in a certain way. And everyone goes through that. I don't think anyone in some sense is immune from small t traumas. Some people do that, big T versus small t traumas. And so things like depression, it could mean that your inner narrative, your perceptions of reality are a little skewed or a little off because you were, say, viciously bullied as a kid, which I was. And that could mean for some people that when you're an adult, you're more likely to be more anxious or worried to trust people or to view the goodness in people. You're worried that they might attack you, or you might not feel you're good enough. You might perpetually feel like a failure, or that you're missing something, you're behind on something, that you're lagging compared to other people because of the experiences that you had. And that can come out as anxiety disorder. That can come out as depression if you're chronically experiencing negative emotion and you have this pessimism, right? You've been programmed to think that because you've been bullied so much that other people, even in your adult life, even if that's not happening, there's a great quote, I think, from Mark Manson, that whatever your stage in life is, psychologically, you're actually 4 years behind. So if you're like 20 years old and you're 4 years behind being bullied in high school, if you're 20, you're still in your mind living this distorted perception. And okay. I would say it's even longer than 4 years. I mean, there's plenty of people I know who something's happened 10 years ago and they're still replaying the same story. So I really feel like we need to overhaul and reconceptualize mental health. And so gender dysphoria and depression and anxiety, I would put as more symptoms of a deeper problem rather than explanations or causes.
Well, for sure. I mean, that is the problem of psychiatry. The DSM entirely, that's psychiatry. It's symptoms because there's no actual, they never know the cause of anything. I mean, maybe schizophrenia, bipolar, you can look at those more as actual. They have a physiological cause. But I had a really interesting and not great experience recently. So when I gave a speech in Lisbon, which was amazing. I not my speech, but the experience of going to Lisbon. I gave a speech, and it was basically about this. It was about gender dysphoria, the diagnosis, and I quoted Alan Francis, who was the chair of the DSM-4 task force. And I like DSM-4 because it has that cool culture-bound syndrome chapter at the back, and I love that. But DSM-4, Alan Francis, ever since DSM-4 was published, he has been speaking out about the epidemics of autism, because he's the one who included Asperger's and triggered an epidemic of Asperger's, of high functioning autism. And he feels that his DSM triggered an epidemic of ADHD when he included that. And so he has spoken out against psychiatric epidemics for many years. So I have a podcast, it's brand new, and I thought, I'm going to invite Alan Francis onto my podcast. And he said yes, and I was super excited. And in my Lisbon speech, the reason I love him is because he's known for saying psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, because it's very easy to get diagnosis wrong, and also because many things that we now call mental disorders are just a natural response to life struggles. And when your life situation improves, those symptoms disappear and you're no longer mentally ill. So always write the diagnosis in pencil. And I thought that was such a gorgeous saying. And I quoted him in my speech. I invite him on my podcast. We're talking about the epidemics of autism and ADHD and all of the problems with the DSM, and how none of these, like, it's so easy to overdiagnose. And then I bring up trans, and the man turned into a trans activist. He basically was accusing my co-host and I, suggesting that we're right wing and that some people are born trans and it's just like being gay. And he couldn't see the most obvious psychiatric epidemic ever to have occurred, even though it's right there before his eyes. And I was just, they say never meet your heroes, which I have to say I've met many of my heroes recently, and I've loved them all. But that guy, it wasn't great. But it's still a great saying, right? Psychiatric diagnoses should always be written in pencil, because you're right. Yeah. It's just a response to life struggles. And I love what you said about what are you eating? Are you getting out? Are you exercising? Are you being social? That's what you need. You don't need antidepressants. You don't need your breasts cut off. You don't need shots of testosterone. You need to just be an embodied human being and be social and be healthy and take control of your life.
I agree. Although there is a more extreme end of this, and the extremist end of it, people like Andrew Tate, mental illness is a myth, and that the therapies for losers or for pussies, and like this kind of just muscle your way through life and just get up in the morning, just get to the gym. And then the more sophisticated version, which I still see some flaws in, actually, is my friend Abigail Schreier, who wrote Bad Therapy.
I love that book.
There's aspects of it that I agree with, but there are aspects of it that I also disagree with, and she doesn't seem to make enough room, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but there doesn't seem to be enough room for kids that are really struggling with anxiety and depression. She doesn't say that it's never useful, I think, but she uses some examples of like bedwetting. I forget, she carves out a couple of examples that are very limited, but like something like anxiety, the prescription that I sense from her is to just get out, do more things, exercise, make new friends, go out, live life. And I just see a lot more utility for psychotherapy than she does, in kids in particular and adults more broadly, which is not the topic of her book. But I see a lot of utility for growing up as a kid. Like when I look back at what I went through as a kid, just as an example, like I had a lot of irrational fears, and I've recently been working through that in therapy now. And I just remember, like, as a kid, like how amazing it would have been to have a good therapist to help me work through that. Things like very like ridiculous things that are not rational. Things like I would develop these fears of like I have a heart problem because I have pain in my chest, because I'm anxious at one thing, or I would like just self-diagnose, like a lot of health anxiety stuff. I'm like, oh, I have diabetes because I have numbness in my feet and I'm having these bladder issues and things like that. And I'd
I
self-diagnose, and like I just live with
yeah.
that in my head all the time. And I think some of the kind of conservative view of you don't need therapy, you just go through life and be resilient and just take on more challenges, I think kind of misses the point and misses the utility of actually talking through what's going on in your head and writing it down and journaling. That's another therapeutic exercise. Talking about it, writing it down, conceptualizing and understanding it through self-compassion, and cathartically releasing it in some cases.
Well, there's definitely science. There's pretty good, solid science to support cognitive behavioral therapy in such situations. I don't remember thinking that Abigail was completely dismissing all of that. I got the idea, like, well, it's been quite some time since I read it. I read it when it first came out, but I think it was about the power of labeling a child was her main concern. Well, first of all, having kids constantly ruminate on their mental health gives them mental health problems. My daughter said this to me. It was so insightful. She's 13, like it's mental health week this week. And so they're talking about mental health all the time at school, and they're being asked to focus on everything. And she said to me at the end of the day yesterday, she's like, mental health week is going to give me mental health issues. And I thought, yeah, it probably is. It's more likely to give you mental health issues than it is to resolve anything for you. But to me, what Abigail was saying is kids don't need to be given diagnostic labels because we embody our labels. I might be making this up because this is something I've written about. But if you give a kid a label, they
Yeah.
come to see themselves through that mental health challenge. So you tell a kid they have ADHD and suddenly they become very much more, they display more ADHD behaviors because they've taken on that label and they know what's expected of a person with ADHD, and they're almost acting it out. They're becoming the ADHD kid. I've seen it in my daughter's friends. Or you tell a
Mm.
kid that they have depression or anxiety, and then they can fall back on it, like, oh, I can't do that because I have anxiety, not I need to just face this. And what you're talking about, the health, like I have years of I've overcome it now naturally, no cognitive behavioral therapy or anything, but I have years of experience being a hypochondriac. I have given myself I once gave myself a psychosomatic case of MS. I became convinced. It was one of my first winters here, and I didn't realize that the wind could be so cold that it could cause nerve damage. And I had like a numb patch on my face that I quickly turned into a psychosomatic case of MS by Googling. They call it
Yeah.
cyberchondria because we Google our symptoms and then we
Yeah.
create symptoms in our bodies. And I had like numbness in my hands and in my legs and everything, but it
Yeah.
was all psychosomatic. So
Yeah.
imagine the power of a label with a kid. I don't know if it builds resilience to be so quickly labeling every kid who's struggling, but I do
Right.
think that there is value for the kid who's really struggling with anxiety to get that child good evidence-based cognitive behavioral
Yeah.
therapy that is going to really help them. So I think I sit probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, yeah. That's well said. Yeah, I think it's the devil's in the details here, and the diagnostics and labeling. The good side of having a sophisticated, or at least semi-sophisticated, comprehensive, meticulously drawn up DSM-5 and psychiatric conceptualization of mental health struggles, which are part of life struggles, is that you have a lot of specificity, and you have descriptions of the human condition, right? And when you read up on some of these things, there is some comfort that is derived there of like, this, and like there's even like health anxiety or psychosomatic issues, or they call it the mind body syndrome. You mentioned psychosomatic issues. I've dealt with so many psychosomatic issues, and the sort of the most advanced, sophisticated, formalized treatment for this that's been developed is pain reprocessing therapy. And I've done podcasts on this, leading researchers in the area. And Alan Gordon has a great book called The Way Out. This guy, Yoni Asher, who's researching this. And they've done some great randomized controlled trials on back pain. But it's really across the board. And for me, it was digestive issues, chest pain, tendonitis in my wrist, eye pain, like a bunch of things. It really spans for some people. It's migraines, lower back pain, where the cause is essentially nervous system dysregulation, or more simply put, fear and anxiety, that your body can somatize pain in certain areas. And the treatment isn't back surgery. Like I have a friend who did back surgery, but his back pain still came back. But the answer was the fear towards the back pain was creating the back pain. That's a very novel, revolutionary paradigm. And then he did this essentially pain reprocessing therapy, which I was going to do with a therapist. There's this therapist trained in this, but I didn't financially, I couldn't afford it at the time. So I just did it on myself after reading the book. Essentially, it was just feeling my chest pain and my digestive issues through a lens of safety and calmness instead of fear and anxiety. And that was excruciating, and that was really hard because it doesn't go away right away. This is it's like a 6-7 month process of just being okay with the pain, and it's not going to go away right away, but then it does go away over time. You're like desensitizing yourself, or you're becoming more calm with the pain, and then the pain just goes away after that. And sometimes it comes back, but then it goes away. Anyway, but
instead of hyper focusing on it, because if you do hyper focus on the pain, you can make it last longer. I diagnosed myself once with ovarian cancer. I was absolutely convinced that I had ovarian cancer, and I had pain, and probably was a short-lived pain because I hyper focused. The pain continued until I guess I got bored of it. I got bored of thinking I had ovarian cancer, and then the pain went away.
Although, but like, to my point with this, like the pain, like the psychosomatic literature that I started reading and the treatments for that, the pain reprocessing therapy stuff, that, like, if I hadn't done any of that, like the pain was just there and it wasn't going away, and I was avoiding the pain and I was trying to live life, but the pain was so debilitating. But when I started doing the pain reprocessing work and developing safety in my nervous system, then it went away eventually. And so it's like this paradox of like, hyper focusing on it is going to make it worse, but at the same time, the way out of it, right? This is the book of The Way Out by Alan Gordon, which is fantastic. The way out is through, as in actually, like, and is essentially sort of meditatively, like, the treatment is just sitting down, eyes closed or eyes open. Eyes closed is better because you can focus on it better. Eyes closed and just going into the pain and just feeling it for what it is and not being afraid of it. So it's not running away from it. It's going inside of it and sort of focusing on it, but being like, sort of confronting the monster and being like, okay, the pain is here. Let's sit with it for 20 minutes. That's hard. Instead of watching TV or video games or just ignoring it, let's go into it. Let's focus on it, but less from a place of fear and worry and just apocalyptic. Oh my God, I'm gonna have a heart attack, or oh my God, this is a sign of something bad. And similarly with what you said about the diagnostic labels, like there's a utility of I'm thinking here of like, then there's a lot of people in my family of different cultures, different understandings of life. There's a utility of someone who's going through a lot of anxiety or depression, who constantly feels like they're on edge, heart's racing all the time. They're always worried. They're always fearful. They're anticipating bad things happening. They're talking really fast. They're anxious about the future. There's a utility of like, oh, anxiety is a thing that a lot of people struggle with. And sometimes when that gets amped up to 10 and you're constantly living this place of anxiety, there's a useful term called anxiety disorder. And my sister just got diagnosed with it, actually. There's a usefulness of talking about it in labels, but but when it goes too far in the psychiatric model, is this is a unique disease that explains your problems, and it's a powerful label that defines your existence. That's sort of going too far with that, like, oh, I have anxiety disorder and that's the definition of my existence. Rather more, it's like, oh, this symptom's popping up, this anxiety is popping up, and it's important to, like, there's a utility in labeling it. I'm curious if you disagree with that, but there's an important, like, I see a lot of utility in labeling it of, oh, anxiety is coming up, and acknowledging it's there rather than neglecting it and just going about life, but rather viewing it as
Yeah.
a symptom, like as a cue or a sign of, oh, something needs to shift in my inner world. And the shift needs to happen, broadly speaking, in a lot of cases, of changing fear patterns, and those fear patterns get developed due to whatever parenting, culture, society, bullying for kids, and there's something that needs to change on the inside to then befriend your anxiety and to view it through a lens of safety and calmness and self-compassion, and to go about in the world anticipating fear and worry less. And so there needs to be some work that needs to be done.
I think I can summarize it as my opinion on this is, if the diagnosis, if the person receiving the diagnosis uses that diagnosis in order to understand themselves and their reactions to certain struggles, and uses the diagnosis as a way to find constructive ways to overcome their challenges, then that diagnosis has helped. If the person
Right.
takes the diagnosis and embodies it, and it becomes their identity, like illness as an identity, and then they use it as a crutch that can excuse all of their failings, and it can, like, I can't do that because I have anxiety disorder, I can't do that because I'm autistic, then they haven't benefited from the diagnosis. So I suppose it does fall on the individual who is in receipt of the diagnosis to go at it, make it beneficial, take the diagnosis, learn something about yourself, and then use that to improve your life. Because otherwise, if you're just like spiraling into your diagnosis and you've given up hope, and you think that that's it, I have autism for the rest of my life, I'm always going to be socially awkward, and I'm always going to have all of these problems because it's a lifelong disorder, that hasn't helped you. That's not. But if you take your autism diagnosis or whatever, and you understand why you have the difficulties that you have, and then you find solutions, then sure, it's helped you.
Yeah. I think if it's a pathway to self-discovery, and it's on the psychiatrist or the psychologist, right, when they're talking about this, right, like it should be like kid is coming in and describing all their anxieties, and the psychologist should say, okay, this is, and I mean, the word anxiety is like, it's like even, I'd even go in so far as depression and even PTSD and OCD. Like, these are, like, everyone's depressed at some period of their life. Everyone's anxious. Everyone has, I don't know, everyone. A lot of people sort of experience anxiety disorder, as in like really bad anxiety at a certain period in life for whatever reason, right? Their landlord's kicking them out, or they lost their job. They're really worried about how they're going to pay their bills, and they have all these symptoms. And so, but the psychologist or the psychiatrist should be like, okay, this is anxiety disorder. Clearly, this is having an effect on your life. This is impacting your ability to be present in school, to do your homework. It's clearly having a negative impact, but we can overcome this, and let's explore some tools on how. And this is not a life-ending issue, but this is something you're dealing with, and you have to acknowledge it. And here are some pathways out. And specifically with the example of ADHD, there's some, I don't know if there's any trials or any studies on kids, but for adults, there's some interesting limited data that I think is incredibly promising for using mindfulness meditation as a pathway out of ADHD, of observing your thoughts. Right? A lot of people, and I would put myself in the ADHD category of sort of on the higher end. I think ADHD is a spectrum. I think everyone has a degree of ADHD, particularly with social media. I would put myself on the higher end as a more creative, imaginative type, as in you're more likely to go into like, I want to do this and that, and you're my dreams and fantasies about the future. It's kind of there's a sort of an archetype of that. I think mindfulness meditation of as Sam Harris, when I interviewed him a couple years ago on my Substack, talked about suffering or just in general intrusive thoughts as being mindfulness alarms. And so using, I'm lost in thought. I mean, that's what meditation is. You're lost in thought. You recognize it. You come back to the breath, or come back to a recognition of pure awareness, absent or transcending thoughts. And so I think a lot of ADHD could be helped through mindfulness of like, oh, you're drifting away in class, you're having all these thoughts. Okay, when that happens, come back to the breath, come back to the present moment, or even touch sensation, come back to grounding yourself in the here and now, and let's start paying attention to what's happening.
Yeah, I'm no fan of the ADHD diagnosis. I think that's well, Alan Francis was right. It triggered a massive epidemic, and then adult ADHD. When I was writing something about the DSM, and I spent months reading the DSM, and they call it psychology student syndrome. It's like med student syndrome, where med students will start to convince themselves they have all these illnesses, but psychology student syndrome, you start to diagnose yourself and everyone around you with mental disorders. And for me, it was reading the checklist of ADHD. It's like forgets to return calls, easily distracted, often loses keys. I'm like, I have ADHD, I have a diagnosis, but what nonsense. It's just somebody I'm doing too much, I'm disorganized, I'm too busy, I've taken on too much. I don't have ADHD. It's just there may be some core people who do have something that is an actual disorder that needs treating, but I think ADHD is just anyone could give themselves a diagnosis of ADHD if they wanted it. And if that's the case, the diagnosis is meaningless. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, or like my perspective on this is trying to maintain some balance here. Like there is a usefulness in a description of ADHD, which I agree I would probably encapsulate the way it's loosely defined would encapsulate 90% of people or 80%, like just like ginormous amounts of people, right, would fall into that.
So it's meaningless, right?
Yeah, well, sure, but the description is interesting, and it serves a purpose. Like it serves like something needs to change, and whether so you're struggling to pay attention, something needs to change, and it might be you're in the wrong job, you're doing the wrong thing, or you need to you need more physical activity, and there's even
you
more
need to get your shit together. If you're like me, you just need to get your shit together. You've taken on too much, get your shit together, put your keys in one place, get organized. It is a symptom.
Yeah.
Does it need to be an official DSM diagnosis? I would say no.
Right. Yeah, but it is a useful description for something, and it's like I would connect this with my interest in Eastern philosophy and spirituality and things like meditation. Like there is an interesting I don't know if anyone's ever written about this or articulated this well, but ADHD, attention, like there's a deficit in your attention right now. You can't pay attention. A lot of times ADHD is like you're thinking in the future, you're daydreaming, like, oh, I would love to be on a beach somewhere, I'd love this life in the future. And it's sort of like my life sucks so badly right now that I want to be there. And I remember talking to Sam Harris about this. We weren't talking about this in this psychiatric context, but I was just talking, and he's a meditation teacher that has something useful to say on this. A lot of people have negative connotations for him because of his political takes, but I was asking him about meditation and how I've struggled to pay attention, and I sort of veer into thoughts about an idealized future, and I've all these reasons why the present sucks and why there's things that are difficult right now and why I'd want this future. And he said, which I truly believe on some fundamental level, that this moment right now is as good of a moment as you'll ever have to be in the present. As in, there's always going to be reasons, right? When you're on the beach with the love of your life or whatever it is, you might get bored and you might be like, oh, I want to read something, I want to do a podcast, or it's like it's fun for 4 days or a week, and it's like, okay, let's go to a different beach, let's have a different and anyone who's had an experience of vacation sort of knows this too. You become weirdly quickly acclimated to some of these things, right? Like I went to Europe last year for a month, and like 2-3 weeks in, I was just observing, and I should probably observe this even better next time if I'm ever on vacation, of like 2-3 weeks in, the incredible pleasure of having pasta and pizza and gelato every day. Like it wasn't like, oh my god, like wow, like we're having pizza, pasta, and it was just like, okay, that's what dinner is here. Like you become accustomed to what's happening in life. And anyone living in the modern, this is a very obvious point, how many of us are actually grateful that we're not living in 14th century England or Canada or US, where everywhere smells like sewage, people are defecating outdoors, there's not warm shelter provided, this, instant Uber Eats and Amazon Prime is not there. How many of us are every day just so deeply we're still focusing on our problems, and people are living in a mental illness epidemic, so-called mental illness epidemic. And so there's an innate human problem of always focusing on your problems and giving yourself reasons to suffer. And so the sort of Buddhist meditative response to that is that that's a natural condition of the human psyche, but that something like mindfulness meditation, as in being aware of the beauty of the present moment, is an antidote to that.
I'm just looking up something because you made me think of something. What's the Tocqueville paradox? It's Alexis de Tocqueville. It's something, I can't find it. It's where, like, when the standard of living increases, the society's expectations increase at a faster rate, to the point that everybody, the higher the standard of living, the less satisfied the population is. And so
Right.
we're there, we are the luckiest human beings ever to have lived. Like, there has never been any person alive who is luckier than those of us in the Western world, with our comfort and with our everything. And yet we don't appreciate it at all, and we expect so much more. No, I agree completely. I do think, I asked Alan Francis about DSM-6, which is in the works, and I asked him if he had any hope for it, and he thinks it's going to be worse than DSM-5. I do think, I think DSM is just it's just billing codes. It's just a way for insurance companies to bill. It's a way for medical therapists to bill insurance companies. But I understand your point that there's a value to the label, as long as it's used in the right way. I think we can agree there.
Yeah. Like something like, trying to think of an example, like post-vacation depression, post-vacation blues. Like if that, like that, that sounds preposterous to add that to as a psychiatric diagnosis. But again, but it's on the same plane for me, having read and researched and thought about this a little bit. It's on the same plane as anxiety and ADHD. Something like post-vacation, like as in this is a normal human response to something. And I like the utility of a label insofar as, like, oh, I'm going through some anxiety right now. Oh, this is a depressive period in life, and using that as a cue, as a mindful cue. Oh, I'm feeling sort of depressed right now. Oh, let's examine. Oh, I'm not getting out enough. I'm not getting enough exercise. Not getting enough sunlight. I should go talk to friends more. I should go to a comedy show. And even more deeply, sometimes something from childhood, some kind of trauma, some kind of inner narrative of sometimes people who get very successful or very wealthy, they publish the big book or the big movie or whatever it is, and they're like, oh, that's not as fulfilling as I thought it was, and fuck, I kind of feel upset about that. And then unwinding all that with the right therapist of, you thought you were going to get something in the big success, and it's not there. And so what is that? It was, you wanted to be validated, you wanted to be accepted. All the people that bullied you in middle school or high school, they, that's that deficit is still there on the inside, and actually you wanted their approval and you didn't get it. And so it's not about the publishing the big book or getting the big graduation from Harvard or the big tech job that you wanted. There's something deeper going on. And so insofar as those labels can be used as cues for self-discovery, it's useful. But I know the culture is not going in that direction. It's going more in the using the labels to define one's existence, the sort of TikTok therapy mindset.
Well, and it's also because of where we are in society. We value victimhood. We are a victimhood culture. That's almost what gets them the social credit, is to have they're displaying their mental disorders. And I think that's like, I'm sure I'm not the first to say this, but when we separated society between the oppressed and the oppressor in identity politics, you have all of these young, distressed, white, so-called cisgender, heterosexual kids who are they're really struggling and they don't really feel much like the oppressor. They feel terrible and they feel horrible and they hate their lives. And so it makes sense if they just take one of those identity label mental illnesses, apply it to their life, and then suddenly they can claim their own form of oppression, and they don't have to have oppressor guilt. They don't have to be the horrible straight cis het white person, you know? So there's something very wrong in society that we value. We reward victimhood. We make it appealing when really we should be encouraging self-sufficiency and health and like my grandmother. I think about my grandmother. The woman lived through a world war, like had a really hard life, not a great marriage, looked after a sick husband, went through all sorts of troubles in her life, and she was one of the happiest, liveliest, lovely people I've ever met. She was always laughing. She was super healthy. She was riding a bike all over the place when she was 70 something years old. And she had the pull your socks up mentality. She didn't go to a therapist. She went through all kinds of difficulties in her life, but she had that's life. Life's difficult. Pull your socks up and get on with it. And I like that mentality so much more than, oh, well, you better go to a therapist and examine every single little thing that might have happened in your life.
Yeah.
That could be just like, pull your socks up, get on with it, put on a brave face, and eventually you'll find that things have improved and you can move on. And life is full of disappointments, but you have to learn how to deal with them.
Yeah, my perspective is just a little bit different on that, which is like I agree with at least half of that. But for me, when you're running into things in reality over and over and over again, and you can't sort of do it yourself, as like you keep running into the same behaviors, or some people, I wouldn't put myself in this category, but some people going from toxic relationship to toxic relationship, and they're like, all I'm finding is toxic people. Like, and I see, some older male friends who might say, I keep finding toxic women who, and like they're attracting a certain type, and that's just one example. And women, I've heard make the same complaint too. And it's like there's sometimes you keep running into the same problem in reality because you're sort of locked into the same algorithm in your mind for some reason. There's something in your behavior, and there's complicated reasons for that. And for me, in certain cases, it's been important to unravel and examine what kind of emotional patterns and inner narratives are shaping certain outcomes in reality, and coming into a place of understanding of, I'll just very briefly say, like in my case, feeling like I'm not doing enough, and then sometimes overcompensating and doing too much, and then pushing people away. That's something I've struggled with a lot. That and that's unraveling that, understanding that, examining that. It's a very long process, and I'm still going through it. And it's very hard to do behavior change. It's very hard. But previously I was just colliding with that issue over and over and over again, and so in that case, just pulling your socks up and living on and just keep doing what you're doing, or trying to improve it yourself, is very hard.
Yeah, I'm sure. Maybe I'm simplifying it too much because I've never had to deal with. I mean, we've all gone through difficult times, but I've never felt the need to seek therapy. I guess I haven't had that level of distress.
Yeah. I'm thinking, we already talked about this earlier before, about doing a second podcast, because I should go here in a sec, and I know you got to go as well. The HHS report we were going to talk about.
We didn't even get to the.
Yes.
We didn't even get to the report. Do you want to do another podcast on the report, or?
Yeah. I think this is a good foundational podcast on gender dysphoria, and I asked some really good questions and things. I learned a lot in this podcast. I think a lot of people will learn a lot from this. And then sort of in the last 20-30 minutes, we got into youth, the child mental health crisis, DSM-5, psychiatry, which is related to all this, which is fascinating. But yeah, in the next podcast, let's go into the HHS report and talk about that. So we'll schedule that soon. I think I'll release that part 1 and part 2, sort of a couple days apart. So I think we can do it that way. But thanks so much for coming on. This was great, and see you soon for another part 2 going into the HHS report.
Thank you for having me.
This episode is sponsored by Alchemy Elements. I've got to say, this stuff has become a staple in my mornings. I start every day with it in my smoothie or protein shake. It tastes amazing, but more importantly, it works. I feel sharper, more focused, more calm, have more energy throughout the day. Alchemy is packed with full spectrum mushrooms and adaptogenic extracts from plants like reishi mushrooms, cordyceps, lion's mane, shilajit, and more. Everything's third-party lab tested, which is really important to me because there are a lot of supplements and natural compounds and herbs available online, but they're not properly tested, and you can never be sure at times if it is safe and effective. In this case, everything's third-party lab tested, which is awesome, and the ingredients are all clean, powerful, and I'm sure you'll be able to feel the difference. Use code ILLUSION at checkout, and you'll save 10% on a one-time order or get 30% off your first subscription order, which comes with this beautiful ritual kit, a gold bottle, a gold spoon, and a gold handheld frother to mix it perfectly every time. Check it out. The link and the information is all in the description below. I highly recommend it. Check it out.